afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Art Basel's Digital Dialogues. My name is Jeni Fulton. I'm the curator of today's program, and a very warm welcome on this very hot day to the auditorium here. We're going to have a really compelling panel that looks at how we are both picturing nature, but also picturing new species, new ideas of nature, and new ecosystems, and what the dangers are of this as well within artificial intelligence. And I'm very, very happy to welcome on stage Linda Douniea, joining us from Dakar. Please give us a big hand for Linda. And Kirkbride, McCormick and Sophia Crespo, otherwise known as Entangled Others, joining us from Lisbon. Please give us a big hand, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so what do we mean by algorithmic ecosystems? We're going to explore the intersection of computational systems and the natural world, really focusing on how artists are using algorithms to reimagine what nature is and what our relationship to nature can be, what memory is, what kind of nostalgia can be as well. A new generation of artists are creating a synthetic natural history through machine learning, training neural networks on data sets of natural specimens to create entirely new life forms that feel strangely familiar, yet otherworldly. What questions can we ask here about evolution, about our imagination, about narratives, about other intelligences, about our culture at large? This panel is going to explore these questions and many more. So, starting off, I'm so used to having a handheld mic, I'm like, oh, I've got this space. So I'm actually just going to turn to my friends and artists here on stage, and especially looking at you, Feli, and you, Sophia. Could you introduce yourselves and your practice briefly? And why Entangled Others?
Yeah, so thanks for coming, everyone. We're Entangled Others. We're an artist duo who've been collaborating for now nearly 7 years. And we collaborate around topics such as complex systems, ecology, the natural world, and how do we use data and create interfaces to data, but also to the natural world. When we first started collaborating, Sophia, who introduced me to the use of neural networks and machine learning, was working very focused on these old natural history archives, sort of pre-photography, which were very instrumental in how we shaped the world. And just like with the microscope, which is something she was using a lot to collect data at the time, it was a way of exploring how can we use technology to bring ourselves closer. Just like the microscope brings us closer to the world around us and helps us understand all these unseen interactions. Sophia was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but still has that, that notion that neural networks and other technologies can do the same for us. And this, combined with my interest for complex systems and how we can approach computation at scale and how things scale up, and how we can make sense of the world for interacting with things beyond what we can perceive, has formed the basis for a variety of collaborations over the last few years.
Super. And Sophia?
Yeah, and I think the name Entangled Others obviously is something that we arrived through talking about what are the things that we're interested in exploring, with our practice. And one of the things was, well, this idea of entanglement as something that brings us closer to the natural world in a way that somehow makes us inseparable from it. And at the same time, this notion of otherness, of being separate, of creating these imaginary boundaries between us and the other inhabitants of the planet. So we wanted to kind of reconcile two things that somehow feel separate and to make sense of this contradiction that we are inhabiting in a way, this idea of the natural, the artificial as two notions that are meant to be completely, separate from one thing from the other. And that's kind of like the space that we inhabit in our practice.
I mean, I think we're going to come to this later, but I do agree with you that it's an entirely sort of fictitious separation. I mean, technology is an extension of us. Technology is inside of us, and we mediate nature through technology, and technology comes from nature. If you think about the rare minerals, the earth, the extractive processes that need to get the computer and the GPUs made that run all these systems on. So I think it's an entirely fictitious separation that comes through various forms of cultural history. But at first I wanted to come to you, Linda, and ask you to briefly introduce yourself and your practice.
Yeah, I come from a design background, and I came into art via, I guess, questioning technologies like boundaries and its ability to include or exclude people, because I used to make interfaces for different people. And so when I started to discover AI, I think one of the first thing I wanted to look at with it was nature, because I think it's such a great metaphor for where it draws its power via the extraction from nature in order to run a lot of the models we use today. But also it is so somehow like inadequate at showing nature in ways that are either correct or interesting. And so that's always been a space that I felt really drawn to. And yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting about how you all in your different practices address questions around knowledge gaps. Now, from a common perspective, it seems like when we talk about science, when we talk about biology, we have a fairly accurate representation of our planet does. I mean, biology has been a science since 250, 300 years now, where we're really trying to categorize the natural world, examine the natural world, look at our species to relate to one another. But actually, when I was looking at your practices in preparation for this talk, what struck me was how you're pointing towards the lack of knowledge. And I was thinking here, Linda in particular, with your project Once Upon a Garden. Can you go into that a little bit, please?
Yeah, it started from a very innocent question. What flowers did my grandma grow up seeing? And then I realized that I had very few tools in order to answer that question in a sophisticated way, because I couldn't just do an online search, which flowers existed in the 1950s or when my grandma was born, for probably in the 1930s. And I found that how we remember the world is a very uneven act, right? In some places we have very thorough, very explorable archives. In some places it's much more fragmentary. And I happen to live in a place where it is fragmentary. And so the only way I could imagine some of the flowers that are probably extinct today, but that my grandma grew up with, was by using AI to sort of fill in the gaps, which is something it does really well, given the way the latent space works.
Amazing. And so basically, if you walk us through the process, because I think we're using a lot of jargon here, right? I mean, LLMs, GANs, filling in spaces. So I think if you could explain how you actually made that project, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so I started with just gathering as much material as I could. So the first thing I could find, which was pretty accurate, was a list of species that were critically endangered or extinct within the Sahel region of West Africa. That was easily findable. Though the last census dates back to 2015, it's still the most accurate records we have. So I have hundreds of species, and then I go each one by one, and then I look for images. And this is when you find out that for some of these species, especially the extinct one, they haven't been observed in nature in decades. And so, or the last time they were observed in nature, we didn't have cameras. And so you have images that are sketches, basically, or you have herbarium, which is the actual dried plant that a scientist would record. And then you'd have annotations. And so when it's possible to bring those three things together, I do. And then I use those as inputs to imagine what the flower might have looked like. So it's almost like an investigative research by way of AI. Yeah.
And you made this, so just so we've got a little bit of what this might look like as a completed art project, you made this into a large-scale installation with images of different flowers. You made this into kind of a digital herbarium, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's possible to sort of explore the herbarium, but within reason, I felt it would be really irresponsible to allow people to see them, especially when models got to a point where you could get photorealistic flowers, because I felt that we bear a responsibility for why these flowers have disappeared, we also bear the responsibility for why they weren't recorded in an even way everywhere around the world. And so why should we see it just because we have the technology to? And so in some instances where it's very almost too real, I kind of put on some graphic elements to try to obfuscate some of the detail.
In the same way that a reproduction, say, in a book that looks at different types of bird species is not going to have a perfect reproduction of a single type of bird because that's not very helpful. Instead, you have a rough approximation of what the majority of this particular species looks like. And in the same way, Feli and Sophia, liquid strata, it's a really beautiful artwork where you look at this idea of ocean snow. Can you talk about that? Because again, that's an under-researched system.
Yeah, marine snow is this beautifully fascinating phenomenon that occurs around the entire world, anywhere where the water goes below 1,000 meters in depth. And it's basically a fall of organic matter, mostly fecal matter actually, as well as dead plankton and other organisms. And it's a fantastically important carbon sequestration mechanism, which by some accounts may sequester as much as 19 million tons of CO2 a day. So it's vitally important, and we know almost nothing about it because we're talking about microscopic particles, you know, the leftovers of microorganisms that are raining across the entire, from the surface of the entire ocean. And the way that, and we've been collaborating with an oceanographer on this, Joan Jort, and the way that they collect data about this is by these Argo floats, which are basically a floating bit of scientific apparatus that drifts with ocean currents, and once every few days will sink down the entirety of that water column trying to sample various details. But the reality is the data is very, very sparse, and it's like sampling 1 millimeter here on the stage and 1 millimeter over there in the far end of the unlimited and trying to figure out what it says about the floor, which is not really very useful at all for us. The reality is this is something we cannot really measure, and to go in there, we can't really dive there physically, so we have to send instrumentation down, which is very disruptive to microorganisms. So we had this work where we have just fragments of data. There's almost nothing there. We have hypotheses, we have lab observations, but the reality is these are all just little pieces of a puzzle for something that is contributing to pretty much every second breath we take. So it's this fascinating sort of tension between what we know and don't. So rather than trying to, for example, take the little bit of available data and train a model, we worked quite differently with this project by working with the oceanographer who's works at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center to develop a simulation model to basically model from what we know this mechanism, this whole system, this whole fall of particles in order to be able to create an impossible view, a fly-on-the-wall perspective, if you will, into a realm that, you know, affects us all, but that we're entirely unable to perceive.
And again, this is then, I mean, I think there's one thing to talk about sort of the methodology, which might seem, which is very complex, but then also to like look at the outputs, you know, and this is another project of yours. I'm sorry, my eyes are not terribly good. That was it, wasn't it? That was Liquid Strata. And you can really see it's a large-scale installation. It's within the courtyard of a beautiful building in Barcelona. And it's not just something that's on the screen. It's not, because I mean, this brings me to another topic that I wanted to talk about with you, which is what do we see as digital art? You know, and I think we've all agreed on the fact that this classification of digital art as a separate medium, as a separate part of the art world is not particularly helpful. Digital art is contemporary art, I would venture to say. And you can see here in these images that we have of your projects that it's a type of sculpture. Yeah. It's out there in the real world. And here you also spoke about site specificity, lovely word, which means that an object is conceived for exactly the site that it's placed in, as with Art Basel's parcours, and has a considered relationship with its surroundings. Could you speak to that, Sophia?
Yeah, for sure. Something we talk about a lot is how we see our practice in a way as land art. You know, we use the tools that we have available to make sense of also of the data we have available to us, you know, knowing our limitations. I love diving as part of my practice, and every time I go diving, I know that my time is limited, you know. So it's kind of like a mindfulness practice for me as well, because it forces me to be in this environment where I'm not naturally designed to be a part of. But it also makes me really appreciate the few photographs I'm able to obtain within that temporal moment, you know? And it also means that through our work, we have to acknowledge our limitations, you know? We can't possibly document the entirety of the natural world, you know? We can't possibly know every single species and represent it equally in a data set. So there's something really important to be said about those limitations. And something that is interesting, at least for us in our practice, is using these technologies to talk about these limitations, you know? That also brings me back to the previous conversation with Kate Crawford that, you know, I think something that's really interesting is using AI to talk about the limitations of AI and specifically the natural world. Sorry if I deviated from the question.
No, I think it's great. I mean, actually, it brings me to my next question, which was, in our conversation yesterday, Linda, you said something really interesting, which was AI today holds a mirror to what we care to remember based on what we recorded. This mirror also shows us what gets left behind in an increasingly more influential tool, AI, in our lives and societies. The question of what's recorded or what gets left behind is a fundamentally political question. It is also one that interests me as an entity in the periphery of this technology. Can you maybe explain and expand on that?
Yeah, I think that positionality matters so much when using AI. So if you're coming from a European, North American context and you use this tool, you are typically more likely to feel represented by it in the sense that it will understand your context. At a very basic level, it will know the city you live in, it will know the history of the city you live in, and you know, it can go into a micro scale of knowing about you, right? And it's not the same for everyone. It's just sort of a fact of the world, because the way AI is trained is we're using data that we've recorded. And so if you look at kind of how different cultures record their histories, it hasn't always been a sort of sovereign act, right? The way, as a Senegalese woman, my history has been recorded. There have been some times where we weren't the one doing the recording. Someone else came into our country and decided, well, we know better than you, we're gonna do it for you, right? And then they left, and then we had to inherit that. But then in the colonial project, you don't also have a sort of handing over of archives. Like, that's not something that happens when countries become independent. People go away with the archives. So then you have these like fragmented archives about the world, especially for countries in the global south. And so they're almost unknowable by models. And for them to be known by models, you would have to fix centuries of broken archives. Right? And so it's not just about fine-tuning the model or fixing the weights so that it shows you more black people, or when you're generating CEOs, it will show you an image of a black person as well. It's not about that. It's much more profound than that. It's that your culture, your context is unknowable because of the history of
because it's not well represented.
Right.
And
it's not well documented.
It's not well documented. Also, and you pointed to the fact that ChatGPT has 40 terabytes of data or something like that, and 80% of it's English, which is not true. It's not representative of the world as we know it. I know those numbers are wrong, by the way. I was just saying that off the top of my head. And I think also, I mean, you talked about your project that we see here, which is The God Between the Waves, right? And that's about kind of your background, where you come from. Can you introduce that? Because that's also about loss, about solastalgia, about extinction.
Yeah, definitely solastalgia is a big word for this project. So I'm from an ethnic group called the Serer, and they're one of the oldest people in West Africa, and they are sort of in the Sahel basin. And one characteristic about this people is that its religious tradition is animist, and so it works in symbiosis with nature. So there isn't a sort of hierarchy of God and humans. It's that there is a plane where humans exist, and then there's a plane where plants exist, and then you get to the sort of in-between plane when you cross those two things. So it's very much rooted in nature. But then you also have this people is based in a region, the Serer people are based in a region that has experienced unprecedented climate change, and loss of biodiversity. And so the very infrastructure, which is trees, that makes their religion possible, has disappeared. And so there's a huge question around how do you maintain this way of life and this way of seeing the world that is in symbiosis with nature that could be useful as an alternative to how the rest of us live, if you have this loss, this just sort of irreparable loss. And so I'm using AI to try to sort of not remember this cosmology, but actually try to remodel it in a way. So can we use a multimodal model in order to essentially revive this religion so that it exists on a plane, on a digital plane, that is always accessible even after nature disappears? And that is, it's just an exploration of grief in the end.
In the same way that we used paper reproduction, printing, to transcribe the foundational myths of Christianity and Judaism. I mean, most of those records were lost as well, and then they were reconstructed 500 to 1,000 years after those events had happened. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really interesting about to see how you're using a contemporary technology to enable the retelling and telling of these stories.
Yes, because the religion is so multimodal. Yeah. It's not just about language, it's also about this choreography, there's sound, there's rhythm, there's also the embodiment, like the visual embodiment of nature. And so you can kind of bring all of those realms together using a multimodal, I mean, in a very limited way, of course. And you can argue that spirituality is completely absent, but at least there's a portal.
There's a recording and there's memory.
Yeah.
And there is a way for people to connect their ancestry in that way. I want to switch gears a little bit because when we talk about AI, it's impossible to have a conversation about AI today and not have a conversation about how it fundamentally changes the world. And I think this is really something that came out of the last conversation, about how different types of models, there's not one type of model, but different types of models are in our everyday existence, they're in our telephones, that it's not just us interacting with ChatGPT. And I think there's a clear delineation to be drawn between sort of corporate AI, so ChatGPT, DALL-E, and all those others, Claude, and all those other systems, and then the kind of AIs that you are using. So, Feileacan and Sophia, I was wondering if you could talk about your smaller models that you're using.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially Feli will probably have a lot to say about this because he's literally working on a project where, he tries to tackle this thing of like how we're trying to make AI bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and actually returning to the most basic type of smaller, low bandwidth data, right? But I think something that's important to point out is that you can have small practices, and we very often get asked so what does your data center look like? And we don't really have a data center, we have literally 4 GPUs. And
graphic processing unit, so the thing that makes your computer show pictures, sorry.
No, absolutely, and it's kind of like imagine 4 people gaming, 4 people using a gaming computer. That's the computing power that we have, to render our graphics. So it is possible to have a smaller practice within this field, and it is possible to train models on limited data and to create still meaningful conversations. That doesn't mean using the products that we're being given by the tech industry. But yeah, Feli, maybe you want to...
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about working with technology is it's a bit like assembling your own paintbrushes from scratch. You take the wood, you whittle the wood, you gather the hair, you bind it, you treat it, and then you can paint. And the interesting thing is because most people's introduction to neural networks or AI is through products rather than the raw materials that make it up. And I think for us as artists, it's a lot of our responsibility is to explore and show, and either in a critical sense or in showing alternative potentials, alternative ways of considering the roles that these technologies can have. For us, it's very interesting to then explore from the question of we have a concept or a phenomena in the natural world, something that resonates with us that we're trying to communicate through our work, and then to explore how can we assemble these tools, how can we work with these limitations in terms of compute or available data, because very often there's very little data available about the natural world. It's not a matter of, going out online and gathering data. No, actually it means collaborating with scientists, making our own sort of, miniature expeditions, finding ways to work around the limitations, even working with synthetic data to, fill in the gaps. So a lot of our practice is exploring not the idea of it chasing some kind of realism or fidelity, but rather exploring what is really necessary to actually create those communications. For example, the work here you see with the work on genetics, that is a work that is very, very small. It's very, very lightweight by any standards because the goal was never realism. It was about exploring these facets and phenomena in how information is encoded and decoded, because ultimately DNA is responsible for all of this mess. It's because we're made of DNA and then we, created data centers and started doing all kinds of weird things at scale, but ultimately it all comes back to DNA again, and you don't need a data center to talk about these things. Rather, there's a lot of inspiring moments that can be found within those limits.
I mean, what we've seen over this sort of discourse in the last 2, 3, 4 years as ChatGPT, as all these systems have come into more public discourse, you made a really interesting point, Linda, yesterday, which was first time we really started talking about AI in a serious way was when DALL-E was launched, because people had the agency to make images. And so you had this form of enculturalization, where you first of all, as a user, user like me who's not particularly experienced and isn't a programmer, could actually press a button and make something go bang, And so I'm interested, and one aspect of this is that we're talking about visual culture, we're talking about art making, which is something that human beings have been doing for 40,000 years. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we're here at Art Basel. And yes, it's only that made this pivot happen, that we were able to start having a discussion. Added on to that, we had this discussion that we don't just want to leave these technologies to the purview of programmers. Yeah. If they are deeply shifting our culture, then we as a culture should have a say in how this is happening. And I wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah, and I think, so Kate brilliantly said it earlier, at the Dartmouth conference, there were programmers, the programmers didn't exist back then, so it was data scientists and people who worked on computing, and then people who were artists and professors and writers. I think that sort of interdisciplinary collaboration doesn't exist at the moment, and it's quite sad, because I think you kind of have a bifurcation of essentially why we use this tool and why they're made. It's kind of the people who make the tool are looking for a sort of Hollywood, glossy, high-def image generation model or a video generation model where you can just tell it what you want and it creates this beautiful imagery that can be used for ads. And really, I think that's kind of ultimately why they're made. It's to be used in advertising. And then you have artists who use these tools and also sort of make them known and attractive by the work that they do with it, which actually goes the opposite way, tries to break them, tries to look at its limits, tries to sort of hack them, right? That's the most interesting work with AI kind of happens in that when artists are able to do those things. And we want more control, but the tools are becoming less steerable over time.
More black boxy.
Right.
You don't know what's behind them. We don't know what's in the training sets of DALL-E, of Claude, of Anthropic, of all these larger companies, including the ones that are producing military-grade AI. So I think to your point as well, I mean, when we were having our pre-discussion, you said something like content engines are being branded as art engines, which is problematic for art as well, I think.
Absolutely. I think the art washing of a lot of these, larger products, or so-called foundational models as they're called, they're often branded as engines for creating art. And the reality is they're content engines. What I mean by this is they are trained on a vast majority of the internet of available data. And their goal, they do just because you can create an image does not mean you create art. I mean, this is a difficult topic, but the reality is, at least from my understanding personally, art emerges from the context of the work rather than, images in this day and age, when anyone can generate an image, when a machine can generate 1 million images a minute, that does not make all those things art, but because when you have these narratives around that machines can create art, that they are somehow, there's a very sort of murky, wish-washy language around, are LLMs sentient? There's a lot of talk about collaborators and these things. And ultimately it boils down, I think, to accountability, because if you're able to brand these massive products as somehow autonomous, somehow, capable...
Smarter than us.
Exactly, but smarter, able to create art, literature, what have you, poetry, you're basically removing your burden of guilt. If there's something that goes wrong, if they, break copyright, if they're, biased, it's on them now. And as artists who train our own models from scratch, we have to curate and collect and create our own data sets, train our models. For us, there is no, there is no excuse. If we do something wrong, if we produce something that's biased or otherwise problematic, that is entirely on us, because, and this is why I generally say I don't work with AI, I work with neural networks and algorithms, because I want to own the responsibility for my work. And I think that this conflation is very useful and very problematic, because very often artists are expected to defend somehow themselves from this kind of onslaught of corporate branding, rather than looking to who really is being affected, which is an entirely different ecosystem of creators, creatives, and also, just general workers.
I mean, as we said before, where is the intelligence and artistic intelligence? And I think this is a question that we need to ask ourselves again and again. Linda, back over to you. Do you want to comment on that?
I think there is a sort of a diffusion of power that happens when you use like a commercial tool. You're thinking, well, I'm not responsible for creating the database, so I'm not responsible for like if it's biased or if it's like extracting from nature. Like I'm just using it, like I'm one drop in the big ocean, right? And I think it's so easy to think that way, and I think maybe the tools want you to think that way even. But when you discover what it takes to train a model, which I think can be accessible to more people, could be. There was a point in time for like a very brief period where there were tools where you could train your own model without code, without knowing how to actually code. And you could do and all of that entirely by using sort of cloud-based GPUs. And that period was so short-lived, because I think industry realized that when people are able to do that and create very small contextualized model, they prefer it, right? And so it lasted about 2 years, and then it was gone. Poof. Yeah. At some point, they just said, we're sunsetting. And everyone who was doing it just said, we're sunsetting these features. Yeah. Please collect your data before it's gone.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was very telling at that moment, because I think this was around 2022, that we were going in a direction of we would not have agency over AI. Like AI was being built for us to be consumers and only consumers, but also unpaid labor, because we were also feeding it our data, right? And so that relationship felt like at that point, agency was never going to be part of the question anymore.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, because the more you become a user, the less interesting your inputs become. And I wanted to talk about this moment about synthetic data and what synthetic data is, and how useful synthetic data is. Maybe you want to define at first synthetic data?
Yeah, I think synthetic data is when you're essentially trying to fill the gap. So in my project, Once Upon a Garden, synthetic data is basically the most important piece of information I have, because I don't have images of flowers to train with. I have to make it up. So I have to use AI to create, or to guesstimate what this flower would have looked like, that I then use to train a model. So a lot of the times what we don't realize is big models are trained largely with synthetic data as well as real data. There's not enough data for all of the models that exist today, and there won't be as we move forward. So there is more and more reliance on synthetic data to make the model strong. And so I think this is something we need to know about and wonder what it means to create synthetic data. It's so much more biased than real data, because
it's
the randomness
taking the biases into its very own construction and displaying them. I mean, an interesting example here is Anna Ridler, another artist who works with kind of the depiction of nature within her practice. And what she did for this tulip project was she photographed 10,000 tulips in the fields of the Netherlands. and she trained to the idea of synthesizing a tulip. And she noticed that the GAN that she was training preferred red tulips for whatever reason. Like, she hadn't coded for that bias, she hadn't told it to make more red tulips. It was just for some reason that we don't understand, and which is actually a little bit concerning, because here it's red tulips, but what if it's kind of you're using ChatGPT as your therapist? It's going in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing is, with synthetic data, it can be a very interesting way of tracing the contours of the gaps. I mean, this is a problem we faced very, very early on when we're very interested in the marine, the aquatic. That's a huge focus in our work. But there is very little available data, and there's even less permissively licensed available data. So a lot of our work was, how do we try and confront that issue? For example, with the work, Sophia's work, Critically Extant, which was started back in 21, working with trying to explore these, how can we counter this bias in social media around which species get recognition as endangered. We started to realize that these tools are very powerful as ways of, because the way a neural networks works is, at least for visual ones, you take a data set of images, and through a long, arduous, very computationally expensive process, it learns the essential visual patterns. It kind of distills out a visual essence. That's in terms of Riddler's work with the red appearing. That is, for example, a feature where there was more, and just enough more red that was distilled as that primary essence, that that statistical closest way of representing the greatest amount of the data set with the least amount of information. And similarly, too, when we work then with large data sets trying to reconstruct critically endangered species or trying to represent marine creatures, what we realized was actually sometimes we cannot get enough data, and we have just about enough data to start tracing the boundaries of our knowledge to make that clear, because when you distill these patterns down, they become a lot more tangible, because you or I, we cannot look at 10,000 images and make a meaningful understanding of those images. We can go from one image, two images, compare those, maybe 10, 15 images, 50 images, 100, 1,000, we're done. Not a chance. So this way of distilling allows us to make tangible what otherwise would be lost to scale. But then with synthetic data, the interesting part of that was, especially as we started to work with researchers and scientists, was it became a way of similarly making tangible the limits of our knowledge, but of the knowledge gained through scientific observation. That kind of data that is even harder to, because it's not necessarily images. It might be observations of patterns within coral growth. So as we were working with the marine, we worked with a fellow researcher, Joel Simon, who'd done a lot of work around genetically evolving corals, which we then used these three-dimensional corals as a data set, because his work focused on how to most accurately model how corals actually grow based upon a swath of research. And that was a way of being able to explore our knowledge of corals, which actually turns out to be very limited and very very uniform. The reality is we don't really represent that diversity very well, because the research is also limited. But that was a way of making that tangible. We otherwise would not have been, because let's face it, we think we have a lot of data about the oceans, but we have nothing. Absolutely nothing.
I know, and that's what frightens me, because right now we're trying to mine them, they're becoming increasingly acid because of the impact of carbon dioxide that's being absorbed by them, and there's just this idea of loss as well that we're trying to counteract by recording this before it's gone forever. And I wanted to actually turn to you again, Sophia, if you could, because Critically Extinct is a really interesting project. It's actually on one of these slides. It's the slightly odd creature. And could you explain what you're trying to do here?
Yeah, so for me, it started kind of as an exploration.
Here it is.
This one is artificial remnants, which is kind of like, it was like the starting point for this idea. And it started by me looking at social media and seeing how there are certain species that we're really invested in protecting, like the red panda or the whales, etc. And thinking how are we speaking about the non-cute species, like a fungus that grows somewhere in the Amazonian rainforest that nobody knows about? And also looking at how they are represented online. So I wanted to research specifically about like what are the gaps in data available about those species, and then training a model that is afterwards forced to fill in the gaps of how to complete an image that it doesn't have data about. And when I shared this idea with engineers, machine learning engineers, they would be like, why would you even be interested in doing that? That's the opposite of what these tools are made for, right? But for me, it was more interesting to look at how to make a species that is not unintentionally imaginary, that points out to a limitation rather than to a strength of machine learning. And that started a whole process for me where otherwise I wouldn't have looked at it that way, Something in my practice that I feel really interested in is how, as humans, we have depicted the natural world throughout time. So how, for instance, in the Middle Ages, we intentionally created imaginary species, but also unintentionally. Many times somebody would travel, would come back from one part of the world, and an illustrator would try to illustrate what this person was describing, but they wouldn't have a clear example of what that species looked like.
The unicorn being a very good example of that.
Right.
Or even
exactly.
the dodo.
Yeah.
So it made me think about how we are doing that today with the natural world. What are those missing gaps in the things that we aren't looking at enough because they aren't fun or cute or.
But it's also like the idea of surrealism, right? Because it's a very surrealistic idea to want to create new species. I mean, if you look at kind of the way Leonora Carrington has these figures who are sort of half tree, half human, or half animal, half human, And to me, there's like this bigger cultural narrative that runs through all of your practices, actually, that touches upon a number of things. One of them is sort of natural history illustrations, and how we depict the natural world, so the reflection of what the natural world is. And then there is the imaginary, which goes into a larger storytelling of the beasts, the bestiarium, the scary things, the things of nightmares, which is just part of what humans do. We tell stories. And just because we're using digital means and like LLMs to do so, it does not mean that they're not part of this wider kind of cultural narrative and this wider network of storytelling.
Yeah.
You're nodding, Linda?
Yeah, I am nodding because I think it is that, but it's also, there's a sort of asterisk now. I think when you're creating a story with AI, you're unintentionally telling the story of how it's made as well. Because it is such a sort of, it's so pervasive. Like AI is everywhere in our lives. Like the same model that we may use to create these beautiful or not so beautiful images of nature are the same models that are predicting whether an image looks like a cancerous bulb or not, right? And also the same image that would not show you an image on social media versus another. It's an everything tool. It does really important critical things, and then also it makes art that is in a different way important, right? So I don't think we have anything that does all of these things and is just sort of tweakable to do all these different things. And so I think the asterisk is that we have to recognize that any story we tell with AI comes with the responsibility of also narrating what AI is and how it's taking from our world, right? Like, I think one of the important things that artists who use AI do today is that we're able to sort of share the way the architecture of AI works, and we're able to expose the sort of material reality of it. We're also able to expose the limitation inherent in the word like intelligence or in the word artificial, and actually just like decompose those and say like that's not always true, right? And so I guess that I would add that asterisk.
And
Sophia,
I wanted to add something to that because for one, I think it's kind of interesting that we're talking so much about the paintbrush, and sometimes I feel that the conversation of our work ends up being more about AI itself than about the work that we're trying to make. And that's also part of what I think is going to take time, to legitimize these kind of practices, to make them, to move away from the tool that's being used and to also be like, okay, well, what is this artist actually trying to talk about, aside from the tool that they use to make the work. And it's also this kind of, I feel, that's why I appreciate attention to, the oceans or the subjects of the work. But I also feel like, it is our role somehow to demystify this technology. We didn't choose that role, It wouldn't have been the role that I would have picked for myself, but I somehow feel this responsibility.
You are extremely innovative in your practice compared to many agents within the traditional art world who are trained in traditional art schools, who have traditional ways of representing objects and showing things. And I don't think there is a hierarchy here. I don't think this is a matter of what's more or less important. I think it's just a matter of fact. You're using advanced technologies in a way that many of us, including me, don't know how to do. So you therefore have this role as well, where we're going to be asking these questions because we're very curious. And this reminds me of like when we were discussing what post-internet art is. When you have this like loss of image hierarchy. There is no longer the original image and the reproduction. The reproduction is somehow less important, but all images have the same kind of veracity within a digital sphere. And I think we're in the middle of a very similar moment here, where we are having to be ambassadors for this type of art making, for this type of technology, until maybe in 5 years' time, maybe in 10 years' time, we are no longer discussing what AI is in art, but we're just saying, oh, look, it's another form of digital art making, and I use these tools, much in the way that no one blinks an eye anymore if someone decides to put an artwork on YouTube or write it or make a website into an artwork, which was quite contentious 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So, yep.
No, and I just wanted to add to that there is this notion of site specificity. It's not a vanity in a sense. The reality is that right now, a lot of the world, just as a time traveler from the 1800s to now, would, for the most part, see a very similar world. Sure, there's more glass, more metals, and so on that were commonly available back then. But the reality is, in horse's carriage, but much would look the same, except for people looking at the glowing rectangles. What substantially changed was the nervous system of society, how we interconnect, shifted in a way that's not immediately tangible. And similarly now, with all these technological developments, with all these attempts from, especially from corporate interests to reshape how, we interface with data, with each other on these forums, the reality is that as an artist, if you're trying to work within your context now, you have to somehow have some kind of considered position or interaction with that, because the world has shifted far beyond what we perhaps have noticed. And as artists, some of our responsibility is to try and tap into what is actually the real
the fourth industrial revolution.
Exactly. The real mundanity here is this weirdness that we're in.
Well, thank you so much for this really lively and interesting discussion. Thank you very much for joining us here at Art Basel. Please join me in giving our panelists a big hand. And please do join us for the next conversation, which will take place at 3:30 in half an hour, on the subject of language, identity, and AI futures with Sasha Stiles and Iskra Velichkova, moderated by Alex Esterick. Thank you very much.